The Crusaders came to the Holy Land with the finest weapons Europe had ever made: heavy swords, steel armor, lances forged by the best blacksmiths on the continent. And they kept losing to men who carried something they didn't understand: a blade that bent without breaking, held an edge that seemed impossible, and cut through iron like it wasn't there. The sword that shouldn't exist. There's a blade in the history of warfare that metallurgists spent centuries trying to explain. It came from the workshops of Syrian and Persian craftsmen, passed through the hands of Arab traders, and ended up on battlefields from the Levant to North Africa. It wasn't just a weapon. It was a material science achievement that the medieval world had no framework to understand. We call it Damascus steel, but that name barely scratches the surface of what it actually was. The pattern on the blade, those flowing, water-like waves running through the metal, wasn't decorative. It wasn't engraving or polish. It was the visible signature of a process happening at the molecular level, a process that European swordsmiths in the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries simply had no access to. And when the Knights of the First Crusade marched into the Middle East in 1096, they were about to find out what that difference meant. Not in a laboratory, but in the middle of a battle they were not prepared for. What made Syrian steel different? To understand why Syrian blades dominated, you have to go back to the source. The raw material was called wood steel, and it didn't come from Syria at all. It originated in southern India, in regions that are today part of Tamil Nadu and Sri Lanka. Indian metalworkers had developed a crucible smelting technique that allowed carbon to distribute itself into iron in a way that was radically different from anything being done in Europe at the time. In Europe, blacksmiths worked with wrought iron and low-carbon steel, hammering, folding, and heating the metal repeatedly to try to distribute carbon as evenly as possible. The result was a blade that was either too hard and brittle or too soft and dull. Finding the right balance was part skill, part luck, and entirely dependent on the individual craftsman's intuition. What's changed that equation entirely? When you melt iron together with carbon-rich organic material, things like with chips, leaves, certain types of plant matter, inside a sealed crucible at very high temperatures, something happens that you can't force and can't rush. The carbon doesn't just blend with the iron. It forms structures. Specifically, it forms what we now call carbide banding, alternating layers of iron-rich and carbon-rich zones running through the metal like geological strata. Those bands are what creates the flowing pattern on the surface of a Damascus blade. And more importantly, those bands are what makes the blade behave in a way that seemed almost supernatural to anyone who encountered it for the first time. The high carbon zones gave the blade extraordinary hardness and edge retention. The cutting edge could be sharpened to a degree that European swords simply couldn't match and hold. But the low carbon zones, interlaced throughout the structure, gave the blade flexibility and resistance to shock. So you had a weapon that held a razor edge and didn't shatter when it hit armor. For any knight who had ever watched his own sword chip, dull, or snap under battlefield conditions, that combination wasn't just impressive. It was maddening. The journey from India to Damascus. The Wootz ingots traveled a long way before they became the blades that terrified Crusader armies. Indian merchants shipped them by sea and overland trade routes to Persia, to the Arabian Peninsula, and eventually to the Syrian city of Damascus. Damascus wasn't where the steel was made. It was where it was transformed. Syrian craftsmen had developed specific techniques for working with Wootz that preserved the carbide structures instead of destroying them, because that was the real danger. If you heated Wootz too high or worked it incorrectly, the banding would disappear. You'd end up with regular steel. Expensive, well-traveled regular steel. The Syrian smiths knew the exact temperature ranges, the exact hammering rhythms, the exact quenching methods that kept the internal structure intact while shaping the blade. This knowledge was guarded carefully, passed from master to apprentice through generations of oral tradition and hands-on practice. There were no manuals, no metallurgical texts describing the carbon content percentages or the thermal cycles. Just accumulated human knowledge encoded in hands, eyes, and experience. And that's part of why it was so impossible for European craftsmen to replicate. Even when they had physical examples in front of them, they could see the result, but they couldn't reverse engineer the process from observation alone. The edge that didn't quit. Let's talk about what happened in actual combat. A European knight's sword in this period was typically made from pattern-welded steel or homogeneous low to medium carbon steel. Both had real strengths. The swords were often well-balanced, well-designed for European-style armored combat, and built to last through repeated use. But edge retention was a chronic problem. After extended combat, and medieval battles often lasted hours, a European blade would lose its sharpness. The edge would roll, chip, or simply dull to the point where cutting efficiency dropped significantly. Soldiers on long campaigns often had no access to proper grinding stones or skilled sharpeners. A dull sword in the middle of a prolonged engagement was not just inconvenient, it was a death sentence. A Damascus blade, by contrast, maintained its edge under conditions that would destroy a European sword's cutting ability. The high carbon zones in the carbide banding were harder than anything a European smith could produce consistently, and hardness is directly related to how long an edge stays sharp. Arab chroniclers of the Crusade period wrote about blades that seemed to never dull, that could cut silk thrown into the air and then cut through iron in the same fight. That wasn't myth. That was the carbide structure working exactly as it was designed to. The blade's edge, at the microscopic level, was a series of tiny carbide teeth. As the softer iron matrix between the carbide particles wore away during use, the harder carbide particles remained, creating a self-sharpening microserration. You were fighting with a blade that was, in a sense, sharpening itself as it cut. No European technology of that era came close to replicating this property. Why European weapons failed in the East. Now here's where the story gets more complicated and more interesting. Because the failure of European weapons in the Crusades wasn't purely a matter of metallurgical inferiority. It was also a story about design assumptions, environmental mismatch, and strategic naivety. European weapons were built for European warfare. The heavy broadsword, for example, was designed around the reality of Northern European combat. Armored opponents, close-quarters fighting, battles fought in relatively cool, temperate climates. The sword needed mass and impact force more than it needed a razor edge, because much of the damage in European armored combat came from blunt trauma, leverage, and grappling rather than clean cuts. That design logic made sense in Europe. In the Levant, everything changed. The climate alone was a serious problem. The heat and aridity of the Middle East accelerated oxidation. European iron and steel rusted faster than craftsmen at home had ever anticipated. Maintenance routines that worked fine in France or Germany were inadequate in the Syrian desert. Blades that should have lasted decades began pitting and weakening within months of sustained campaign use. The weight of European armor and weapons also became a battlefield liability in a way it never was at home. In Northern European combat, heavy armor was largely offset by the fact that your opponent was also heavily armored and equally slowed. You were fighting in the same weight class against light, mobile Arab cavalry who could disengage, circle, attack from range, and simply refuse to fight the kind of close-quarters battle that European weapons were designed to win. Weight became a trap. Knights who dismounted or became separated found themselves in heavy armor, in extreme heat, with weapons that required sustained physical leverage to be effective against opponents who were faster, cooler, and conserving energy. The bow problem no one wanted to solve. There's another dimension of this failure that European military culture actively resisted acknowledging. The composite bow used by Arab, Seljuk, and later Mamluk warriors was, in many respects, the most devastating ranged weapon on the medieval battlefield. It was shorter than the English longbow, but far more powerful for its size, made from layers of horn, wood, and sinew laminated together under pressure, a construction process that took months or years per bow. The draw weight of these composite bows allowed arrows to penetrate mail and, at closer ranges, early plate armor. European knights had a deeply ingrained cultural bias against ranged combat. Archery was associated with peasants and lower-status soldiers. A knight fought at close range, on horseback, sword in hand. That was the identity, not just the tactic. So even when European commanders could see clearly that their opponents were using ranged weapons with devastating effect, the cultural and social structure of the knightly class resisted adapting. You couldn't just tell a knight to pick up a bow. That wasn't the problem. The problem was that the entire system of European medieval warfare, its economics, its social hierarchies, its training from childhood, was built around close-quarters armored combat. Adapting would have required dismantling something much larger than a weapon preference. It would have required questioning a way of life. And armies rarely do that quickly or willingly. The metallurgical gap, how wide was it really? It's important to be precise here because the history of this period is often simplified into a story of Eastern genius versus Western ignorance, and that's not quite right. European smiths in this era were skilled craftsmen producing weapons of genuine quality. The pattern-welded swords of the earlier Viking Age were sophisticated objects requiring real technical mastery, and by the 11th and 12th centuries, European sword-making had continued to evolve. The gap wasn't one of intelligence or craftsmanship. It was a gap of raw materials and specific process knowledge. European smiths didn't have access to wood ingots in meaningful quantities. They were working with different source materials that had different properties, and they were developing techniques suited to those materials. Carburization, the process of packing iron in charcoal and heating it to allow carbon to diffuse into the surface, was understood and practiced in Europe. But it produced a different result than crucible cast woods, a case-hardened surface rather than a through-hardened structure with internal carbide banding. When European smiths encountered Damascus blades during the Crusades and tried to figure out how they were made, they were essentially trying to work backward from a finished product without knowing what raw material had been used. Some attempted to replicate the pattern through forge welding different steels together, creating what collectors now call European pattern welding. It produced beautiful blades, but didn't reproduce the carbide microstructure that gave Damascus steel its unique edge-holding properties. They were solving the aesthetic problem while missing the functional one entirely. What the battlefield evidence actually shows. Let's step back from materials and look at what actually happened in the field. The First Crusade, launched in 1096, achieved its objectives, taking Jerusalem in 1099, largely through strategic surprise, internal divisions among Muslim powers in the region, and the logistical momentum of an initial campaign that moved faster than the regional powers could coordinate against. It was not a triumph of European weapons over Syrian ones. The Second Crusade, launched in 1147, ended in humiliation and near-total failure. The Third Crusade, led by Richard I of England among others, produced some tactical victories but failed to recapture Jerusalem. And the pattern of subsequent crusades was one of declining European effectiveness against increasingly well-organized opposition. The military orders, the Knights Templar, the Hospitallers, the Teutonic Knights, actually adapted more effectively than the secular Crusader forces. They adopted local knowledge, modified their equipment and tactics for the environment, and developed supply and logistical systems that could sustain long campaigns in the region. They also, critically, began employing local fighters and integrating regional weapon types into their own arsenals. The Templars in particular were known to have used curved blades and lighter, faster horses acquired from local sources, weapons that worked in the terrain and climate of the Levant rather than weapons imported unchanged from Europe. That adaptation gap between forces that updated their toolkit and forces that didn't was one of the clearest predictors of battlefield success in the entire Crusade period. The secret that died. Here's one of the most remarkable footnotes in the history of metallurgy. The process for making true Damascus steel, the crucible wood process with its specific thermal cycles and material compositions, was eventually lost. Not stolen, not suppressed, just lost. By the late 18th century, the knowledge had disappeared from the workshops of Syria, Persia, and India. Historians and metallurgists debate exactly why. The most likely explanation involves a combination of factors: the disruption of trade routes that supplied specific Wootz ingots, the death of key master craftsmen without successfully transmitting their knowledge, and the gradual replacement of these labor-intensive production methods by cheaper and faster alternatives. European colonial-era trade networks had, ironically, both created new markets and disrupted the ancient supply chains that made the Damascus process possible. What remained were the blades themselves in museums, in private collections, in royal armories, physical objects that scientists couldn't fully explain using the materials science of the 18th and 19th centuries. It wasn't until the 20th century, with electron microscopy and modern materials analysis, that researchers finally confirmed what the carbide banding structure actually was and why it produced the properties that medieval chroniclers had described. And even then, recreating the process from scratch, without the original Wootz ingots from those specific Indian ore deposits, proved extraordinarily difficult. Some researchers believe the specific ore deposits used for the original Wootz steel had properties, trace elements, particular carbon inclusion patterns that may no longer be easily reproducible. The secret wasn't just knowledge. It was a combination of knowledge, materials, and geography that aligned for a specific window in history, and then came apart. What this means beyond the battlefield. There's a lesson embedded in this story that goes well beyond swords and armor. European knights weren't stupid. The craftsmen who forged their weapons weren't inferior. The failure wasn't one of intelligence or ambition. It was a failure of assumption. The assumption that what worked at home would work everywhere. That tools designed for one environment would transfer cleanly to another. That cultural prestige, the meaning attached to a sword, to heavy armor, to close-quarters combat, could substitute for adaptability. Those assumptions cost lives. They shaped the outcome of campaigns. They contributed to the eventual collapse of the Crusader states. The Syrian craftsmen and the warriors who carried their blades had the advantage of fighting in their own environment, with weapons evolved specifically for that environment, and without the cultural rigidity that prevented their opponents from adapting. That's not an exclusively medieval problem. Every era has its version of the knight refusing to pick up the bow. Every organization has its version of importing tools designed for one context into a completely different one and wondering why they're underperforming. The Damascus blade is a 900-year-old lesson in the difference between quality and fit, between what is objectively impressive and what actually works in the conditions in front of you. The legacy that survived the secret. Damascus steel may be lost in its original form, but its legacy runs through the entire history of materials science. The Crusade era encounters between European and Syrian weapons created a demand in Europe for better steel that drove centuries of metallurgical experimentation. The Toledo steel industry in Spain, which became one of Europe's most famous sword-making traditions, developed in a region where Islamic and Christian metalworking traditions overlapped directly, absorbing techniques and trade knowledge that wouldn't have existed without that contact. The Japanese tradition of tamahagane, the complex folded steel used in katana production, developed independently, but produced similar results through different means, a parallel solution to the same fundamental metallurgical problem of combining hardness with flexibility. And the modern field of high-performance alloys, the steels and composites used in aerospace, surgical instruments, and industrial cutting tools, is in a direct intellectual line from the questions that Damascus blades first raised. How do you make a material that is simultaneously hard and flexible, that holds an edge under extreme conditions, that maintains structural integrity when everything around is trying to destroy it? Medieval smiths didn't have the vocabulary of material science, but they were asking the same questions that materials engineers ask today. The difference is we now have the tools to answer them. Final thought. The next time you see a photograph of a Damascus blade with those flowing patterns moving through the steel like water, remember that you're looking at material science achievement produced without microscopes, without spectrometers, without controlled laboratory environments. produced by craftsmen working by firelight, by the color of heated metal, by the feel of a hammer and the sound of steel under stress. And remember that this object traveled from the mines of southern India, through the workshops of Persian and Syrian smiths, onto the battlefields of the Crusades, where it met some of the most heavily armored warriors in the Western world, and made them feel under-equipped. That's not just history. That's a reminder of what human ingenuity looks like when it has time, tradition, and the right raw materials to work with, and of what happens when you walk into someone else's world, carrying only the tools built for your own.